I usually like to give a disclaimer at the beginning. I am not a historian, but, I see you laughing there, but I'm going to talk about some aspects of history, our collective history in my conversation this morning. So I wanted to start with a baseline definition of culture. So this actually comes from anthropologists and sociologists in terms of how we define culture. And so a person's cultural identity is dynamic and fluid. It changes all the time. The way I may have identified as a young woman is different now than how I may identify as an older woman. So, and this applies to everyone. It's a system of shared values, beliefs, ideas, and learned patterns of behavior. It's explicit and implicit. It's a way in which we as people interpret the world. Cultural identity influences how we behave, how we act, what we believe, and what we actually know. So with that as the baseline, what comes with cultural identity? Well, nationality comes with cultural identity, language. I also put here this particular wheel that speaks to the different things that make up culture, but I also think it's important for us to talk about, as human beings, when we are going through our development, having the ability to connect and answer that question, who am I, is channeled and often challenged by our environment in which we grew up in, not just within our family structure, but our collective community, national and global community. And why identity is so important and why there's so many folks who study identity and talk about it is that having an identity, having a sense of who you are, it creates a sense of pride, right? Can we agree with that?
Yes.
It also gives you a connection to humanity and helps give you a sense of purpose. And so as human beings, we go through life answering that philosophical question of who am I? And so we're exposed to these different aspects of the what's called the cultural wheel that influence how we interact with each other and how we perceive ourselves and experience the world. So the aspect I'm going to talk about a little bit deeper is within cultural identity development is racial development. So unlike gender and sexual development, there are no biological changes that push for growth for racial development. Everyone is familiar with the ideology that race is a social construct, okay? There's no differences in our DNA, but again, race has been used as a structure and has defined the experiences of many of us as humans for centuries. And so, as I've said, race as a social construct is defined by social culture and norms. And racial identity development is a social process. So to give a compare and contrast, if we were to compare racial identity development in European Americans, in a social culture where European Americans predominate, there is no or little external social push for racial identity development for European Americans. Okay, it's not something that you have to think about growing up, whether you're in America or in another country, as a person who may identify as European or white, that you have to think about your whiteness, because typically you are the dominant culture, okay? So that's what I mean by there's no external social push for racial identity development for folks within that dominant group. European Americans can grow, develop, and mature in a social milieu that does not challenge them to think much about their race. Their racial identity may more so be defined as a social political identity, as a way that they see themselves. I give an example: liberal, you can say conservative, etc. As liberals, you know, the ideology that comes with that is that we typically, as liberals, embrace all people. We're curious about different cultural practices, also support this concept of religious diversity. The other aspect of European American identity development is that they actually may deny their whiteness and may say that they don't see color when interacting with others. And so this displays itself in various institutions, whether you talk about education, healthcare. I treat everyone the same. I don't see you as a person of color. I don't see you as a woman. I just see you as a person which inherently denies the existence of racial and social aspects of our experiences as people on this planet, okay? So I want to juxtaposition that with racial identity development, in particular for African Americans. And so as African Americans, we have to develop a way to understand racial bias in a very broad way at a very young age. I can reflect on my own experiences as a child with my parents. I often tell people I'm a byproduct of social agitators and a long line of social agitators. And so having this understanding and gaining this understanding at a young age is crucial and essential for African Americans for our survival, right? And so this identity or this self-awareness about being a person of color, being black, this self-awareness develops as part of cognitive growth, usually around preschool age, and makes a really large developmental leap around the age of 8. So if you were to, I don't know if folks remember the study that was done during the push to desegregate schools with Brown versus Board of Education and the doll test, and the whole, I know Harvard University did a study recently about implicit and explicit bias. So if you were to poll children around preschool age, 2nd grade, and ask them, you know, how do you define goodness or something that's bad based off of the look of, in this case with the doll test, black dolls versus white dolls, an overwhelming majority of black children would identify black as something negative and white as something positive. And that has nothing to do with what they may have experienced in their home. When they're outside of their home, the outside world through media and other messaging dictates what is good and what is bad. So is everybody still with me?
Yes.
So these negative messages about people, in particular as African Americans, impact our self-image and self-concept. So that question of who am I, what do people think about me, what does having darker skin mean? And so we don't have time to get into colorism, which is a whole other conversation, but I just wanted to give you some basic concept. So I wanted to talk about, I don't know if everyone can see this, but again, I've already talked about how identity shapes the way, well, culture is the way in which we perceive and experience the world. And so what are the factors that influence that? So I wanted to give you just a couple examples. Like I said, as a disclaimer, I'm not a historian, but I wanted to give you a couple examples. So specifically, I wanted to talk about the historical influence of media on black cultural identity development. So as you see here, this is actually an advertisement for Pierce Soap, which was a pretty popular product, I believe, up and through the 1940s, 50s. It was a popular company. And so this particular advertisement, this was actually done in the 1890s. And this was an ad for soap. So something as simple as soap, okay, was sending the message about what's good and what's bad. So if you look at some of the things here, so you have, you know, the general here who's utilizing Pierce soap. And so you see these respective ships who are bringing the cleanliness to the native folks in this country that they are dispersing the soap at, right? So, and if you look at the message, it says the first step towards lightening the white man's burden. I know folks may be familiar with Rudyard Kipling's book, The White Burden, and all of the things that come with that. And so, just with this advertisement for soap, the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. So, in the 1890s, people seeing this began to get messages that being dark represented something that was unclean, okay? And so whiteness represented cleanliness. And so to follow on with the rest of the language in the advertisement, Pierce soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances. While amongst the cultured of all nations, it holds the highest place. It is the ideal toilet soap. So if we think about media today and advertising, right, we're all influenced by media and advertising, are we not? Yes. So it defines and gives us concepts on what we buy, what we purchase, right? That's part of the byproduct of being in a capitalist society, but again, it's a whole other conversation. But again, if you just think about, for something as an animate object as soap, And that's conveying a message about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. So let's come a little forward, right? So this came from Harper's Weekly, and this was in 1868. And so this image here has a lot of messages in it. So I would like to ask you in the audience, what are some of the images in this picture? What does it say to you? Anybody?
Well, it looks like we got people with foot on one person down there on the bottom with the American flag, so we know who that is. And the three individuals are different ethnicities here in this country.
Anyone else thoughts on kind of what does this image say to you? Because remember, we've been talking about racial identity development, right? Yep, go ahead.
All of them seem to have all the rights.
Mm-hmm.
One has the right to vote, the other one has a capital in his hand, the one in the middle has a knife. I don't see exactly what it says, but it seems like they are the ones who are making the rules and the regulations.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Kind of what does this image say to you? So again, we can always come back to that, but if you reflect on what I've been talking about this morning so far, we're talking about identity development, right? And so I've been comparing and contrasting what that has looked like historically. And so with this particular picture, if you think about the time frame, this is in 1868, so not too soon after, the Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation. And so you can't see it at the bottom here. I'm going to read this message to you, that what it says at the bottom. It says, "We regard the Reconstruction Acts, or so-called, of Congress as separations, unconstitutional, revolutionary, and void." Okay? So remember in the beginning where I talked about culture and cultural identity and how it's fluid and dynamic and it changes over time? So some of the representation of the different ethnic groups that are here, in America, when the Irish first came here, they weren't necessarily accepted, right? And so they were typecast as monkeys. And so this particular individual represents Irish Americans. And so you see that there's an agreement, right? You see the three of them shaking hands, so that implies some type of an agreement. So in our larger society, having a more Eurocentralized view of the world and being a part of that dominant group allows you more power and privilege, does it not?
Yes.
And so one of the things, in particular in America, that definition of, based off of Eurocentralized view or whiteness, changed over time. And so with this tacit agreement here that you see in the picture implies that if there was they call it like the gentleman's agreement, right? Or an agreement that you would have access to power and privilege if you committed to the notion of oppression, right? Because this idea of advantage and disadvantage. And so if you engaged in different practices and policies that marginalized or oppressed, and historically in our country, people of color, in particular blacks, that gave you access to our various systems. When you talk about voting, if you look at the way in which the Electoral College was set up, how our government is structured in regards to representation, and even if you factor in present day, what our elected officials look like in terms of in our respective communities, just to give you some context of the structural overview. So again, this agreement, as shown in the picture, you would gain access to whiteness if you agreed to engage in oppressive practices. So for some folks, where again, this predates all of us in this room, right? Yes. So